Thank you for having me, and thank you to the Brain Injury Association of York Region for having me for this talk. As you mentioned, I'm an occupational therapist. I have a research background in TBI. I did my PhD in MTBI in youth athletes that were concussed. And so that's my background. I see people across the lifespan with special interest in brain injury. And I work at Omega Medical in my capacity as a catastrophic determination assessor. So that's a little bit about me. And before I continue, a special thank you to Omega Medical for asking me to do this, and Sandra D'Souza, who's the executive director there, for offering her feedback and collaboration on drafting this presentation. So thank you. So sorry, I see. Oh, there we go. Okay, so what you can expect from today's presentation. I'm going to do my best to make this very conversational. I know that we're a nice, tight group, so feel free to interrupt me. And if I don't see the prompts because I'm screen sharing, Mary's going to help me navigate that. But what you can expect for today is a definition of fatigue and understanding what fatigue means, not just from the perspective of someone with TBI, but also all the other factors that make up what might make us feel tired, like the activities we have to do, the environment that we live in. The third thing is going to be reflecting on the good old days bias as a way to normalize fatigue. And I'll unpack this more as the presentation progresses. The other thing is to consider the role of the healthcare provider in fatigue management. And I don't know if there are any healthcare providers in the audience, but certainly good to know as consumers of healthcare, what you might expect from your provider in this domain. And of course, in the end, I will go over a high-level kind of evidence-based research study, which kind of looked at the evidence of different approaches to managing fatigue and how effective those are at reducing fatigue symptoms. And then, of course, we'll walk away with general principles and an understanding that not all fatigue is created equal. So before we get started, I actually wanted to ask everyone in the audience, if you can put it in the chat, no pressure, but what is your baseline? And what I mean by that is right now, considering your day and how you're feeling, I want you to rate how tired you are. 0 being you feel perfectly fine, perfectly energetic. 5 being, okay, I'm a little fatigued, but I'm still functional. And 10 is I'm on the brink of sleeping or taking a nap. And I'm curious to see what everyone responds. Thank you, Sandra. 7. Okay, that's tired. Anyone else care to share? 3. Okay. I'll self-disclose. I'm at about a 4 right now. So we can see already that there's such a range, that no human is created equal, and that all of us, that these are just numbers, of course, but all come with our own factors that drive that number, whether or not we have a TBI. So what is atypical fatigue? And what I mean by atypical is, of course, we all experience fatigue in our everyday life. This is a part of our circadian rhythms. We are supposed to feel tired. We're supposed to go to sleep at night to get our 6 to 8 hours of sleep. What I mean by atypical fatigue is when it is experienced above and beyond what we would want and expect to function on a day-to-day basis. It's regulated by our central nervous system. Our brain tells us when we're fatigued. And in the case of TBI, the theory is that this central nervous system tells us we're fatigued even when you think you might not be. And so this leads to disruptions in the autonomic nervous system, which is just a system that says whether you should ramp up and get excitable, as in fight or flight, or whether you should dampen down your system and rest and digest. And ultimately, what does this look like in everyday life? It means that we experience way more fatigue than we would otherwise expect to do daily activities, simple mental tasks, it means that we have a lower threshold for physical and mental activity, which means we could only do maybe 5 or 10 minutes when we might expect ourselves to do maybe hours at a time without getting tired. And the last piece, which all of us just illustrated, is that it is very subjective. There is not a right or wrong way to experience fatigue, and it's unique to us as individuals. And of course, it's marked by decreased energy levels and the need for more rest than would be typically required. Fatigue is multifactorial. So this is really where I want to drive home the main message of the presentation, is knowing that it's not just about us as individuals that drive how tired we are. It's about the things we need to do, the activities, and in the environment with which we live. And all of these things help us to function day to day, to tolerate activity. And so from a personal standpoint, we all come with pre-existing histories, perhaps vulnerabilities, on top of having a TBI, like age or social history, different diagnoses outside of just having a TBI. Perhaps it's a mental health issue or broken bones, disability perceptions, and also just our symptom state, how we experience our physical, cognitive, and emotional symptoms. The activity domain is concerned about what we need to do on a regular basis, what we want to do, what we need to do, what we're expected to do. Some of us have parenting responsibilities, we have chores to complete, work to attend to, and of course, our social and recreational pursuits, what we do in our spare time. In our environment, we are this individual that exists within our rehabilitation teams, perhaps our legal teams, and within our family and support systems. And all of these things kind of transact. They have a relationship with one another. And this is what impacts daily functioning and the experience of fatigue. So I'm going to start with talking about the person. As I started off by saying, fatigue is not specific. It's not specifically related or experienced only by those with TBI. We see this across a lot of clinical populations like mental health issues, orthopedic injuries, chronic health conditions. And so it's not unique, which means it's challenging to understand, discern, and rehab. What does it look like? From a physical standpoint, of course, it means poor stamina. It might manifest in things like headaches or just general body aches. When you're really, really exhausted, going back to the system dysregulation, we can't digest as well, we're not sleeping as well, we're more sensitive to our environments, and that could mean lighter noise. Cognitively, we might feel much slower. We could have difficulty with new learning. Things feel like you're struggling and working really, really hard to do something that you were able to do easily before. Emotionally, this might mean that you have mood swings, or that you get frustrated easily, or you lose your cool. Or in personality changes, you're not the same person that you were before altogether. And so I wanted to kind of put this to quotes, things that those with TBIs have told me during assessments. From a physical standpoint, they say things like, there's too much going on right now. My whole body hurts. Cognitively, I feel like I'm doing this so slowly. I can't even think about the weekend right now. So the sense of cognitive overload and overwhelm with daily activities. Emotionally, I'm exhausted and want to be left alone right now. I don't even have the energy for a phone call. So again, that fatigue is slowing down what they have in their energy reserve tank to do all the things that they need to do and want to do. So I bring you to the good old days bias. And so I don't know if any of you watch The Office. It's a pretty funny show. It's an old one, but a good one. I wish there was a time that you could recall you're in the good old days before you've actually left them. And so let me explain what that actually means. So this is a concept and a psychological misperception that's been established in the mild TBI population, okay? And that people living with brain injury often underestimate past problems. So thinking, before I was injured, I was perfect. My fatigue was 0. I led a perfect life. I had amazing energy. I was never tired. And so simply put, those with brain injury report their pre-injury functioning as better than even the average person. So that's an interesting finding, that they reflect that they were doing even better than someone that was not injured. And this perception can negatively impact their problems, recovery, return to work, and other daily activities. So going back to this idea that fatigue is multifactorial. So I come back now to the environment, the rehab team, the legal context, the external environment that we live in. So here, fatigue can become a negative feedback loop. So I want to walk you through kind of this formula and concept here. Going back to this idea of perceptions, we just talked about the good old days bias, the misperception that we were doing better off before we were injured. The disability perception here is the actual thought, I can't do it, okay? And when you think that way, I can't do it, so I won't do it. And you get stuck in this loop. I can't, so I won't. I can't, so I won't. And you avoid activity. And then this, over time, leads to something that I like to coin functional deconditioning. We hear of muscle deconditioning all the time, right? I haven't exercised in 6 weeks. I don't feel good to get back out for a run. But in this way, functional deconditioning means such a long length of time has passed where you haven't done something. So now you haven't done it. And actually at this point, now you can't tolerate it, right? If you're not used to sprinting every day up a hill, then when you haven't done that after 6 months and then you finally try and take a sprint up a hill, of course you can't tolerate it. I would be taxed too. And so the point I want to make here is all of these things end up leading to poor functioning and an empty daily routine, which means that when we say we can't, so we don't, and then we haven't done it, and then we finally can't tolerate it, our days look empty. We avoid activity. There's a lot of rest. And then this just becomes a negative feedback loop of avoiding, becoming more deconditioned, and taking that much longer to get back to what we want to do and need to do. And so here, if there's any clinicians in the audience, I would argue that disability perception in those early days is where we should have the opportunity to break that cycle while they are still conditioned to do it, so that we can change their minds about can't into trying and doing symptom limited activity versus complete activity avoidance. I hope that concept is clear. And if it's not, please feel free to interrupt me and I can go back and explain. I don't see any raised hands, so I'm going to continue. Okay. And so here it becomes really important to then reframe and normalize fatigue. And so this is where, for those of you who are TBI survivors or who have lived experience or are caring for someone, these are things to keep in mind as you continue on your recovery pathways or deal with healthcare providers. And you can see here, this is not a linear pathway. You don't go from extreme fatigue to back to your baseline status, and maybe it's reframing where that new baseline status is, depending on where you're at in your life. But this image is really to depict the fact that there are valleys and mountains. Sometimes it's easy and sometimes it's not. So here, the message that I want to drive home in terms of understanding that it's a normal part of recovery is that you should expect it, that you're not alone in your experience, and that it is a normal aspect of engaging in activity, the experience of fatigue itself, and that it is uncomfortable. Recovery and fatigue certainly is not fun. It is not meant to be fun, but it might be a necessary experience to an extent to recondition the brain and the body. I know I used, running up a hill as an example, but you can consider your brain here as a muscle that needs to work really hard in order to maintain that energy it needs to get up and go, to think of tasks to do, to carry out your life, to have a really fulfilling, busy routine, the one that you hope to have in your everyday life. Some activities will cause more fatigue than others. That is true. So this means that we shouldn't walk into everything thinking it's going to drain us. We should be equipped that some things might take away a lot of energy and some things might only take away a bit of energy. And I'll talk more later on in the presentation about how we could address that so we maximize the energy we do have. Here's a really, really important part. Being rigid about fatigue avoidance will likely cause more fatigue. This goes back to the negative feedback loop of deconditioning. And what I mean by this is sometimes I see clients, TBI survivors, those with lived experience saying, oh, I just can't do that. Because if I do that, then this, and this. But oh, I just loved doing it before. I loved going to restaurants before, but I can't. I won't do it now because it's going to result in this. That might be true, but the cost of not doing it might be greater. And if we continuously stop ourselves from trying, even in small ways, we might actually perpetuate more fatigue for ourselves. The goal, and so I want to make this clear, I'm not saying your fatigue is discounted. Absolutely not. Your fatigue is valid and expected and normal and certainly validated. But my point is that there should be a balance between, and a comfortable balance, each individual to us, between rest and activity. We need to work on expanding our daily repertoire, our routine, what activities we do in a day, with the hope that we gradually return to a desired status, functional status, that is. And so if there are any healthcare providers in the audience, I have some reflection questions for you, and I'll kind of explain what I mean by them without getting into too much nitty-gritty detail. The first thing that clinicians should consider is, are they providing education on both rest and activity to manage fatigue symptoms? So not just saying, when you're tired, take a break. Are they saying, have you found something else to do? Have you found something else that you can compensate for this fatigue? Maybe you're too tired on the computer, but how about going for a walk? The second question is, have I advised against engaging in certain activities? This sometimes happens. And of course, there are medical contraindications, which means that some people present with complexities that mean that they cannot go back to a certain activity because they're at risk for more severe brain injury, and other circumstances where healthcare providers maybe aren't fully aware of the fact that they can prescribe healthy amounts of activity. And so sometimes what I see is clients say, my so-and-so told me I can't do this anymore. My so-and-so told me I shouldn't really be doing X, Y, Z. But the truth is, you hold the power to your own activity. And as long as it's not risky, in the case of something that has been medically recommended against, then I would say that it's absolutely in your power to work with your healthcare providers to see things that you are able to do. The third is, do my recommendations align with the larger team's rehab goals? What I mean by that is some of you may have experienced having an OT, a physio, maybe a massage therapist, a chiropractor. The list can go on and on and on. Different types of neuro specialties, and the teams can get quite large. And so as a healthcare provider, you're not just treating the person in the context of your own specialty. For me as an OT, you're also considering what other people are telling you to do, so that the message is very clear. That one person is saying you shouldn't be doing this anymore, and another person is saying, sure, go ahead. And so being on the same page about rest and activity. Are my recommendations realistic in the context of the client's rehab treatment schedule? What do I mean by that? Another example, sometimes I see people 2-3 years after a TBI, and their schedule is that they spend upwards of 20 hours in appointments throughout the week for one reason or another. And when I ask them questions like, why haven't you gone back to this? They say, I can't, I'm at rehab. And so, of course, I'm not discounting rehab efforts whatsoever. What I'm saying is to be cognizant of the amount of time that is spent not living a life, getting back to things that you would be doing if you weren't injured. And so that's what I mean by that. And I hope the audience doesn't take that in a negative context, because it's truly meant to say that introducing a return to life and living in the ways that we all need to and want to is really, really critically important in the context of TBI and fatigue and getting back to our normal energy levels. Going back to I guess the main thesis of the talk, that all of these factors interact in a very complex, nuanced way. And so now I'll head into the actual activities. So I talked about the person, and all of you are probably very familiar with all the ways in which you feel fatigue and how that manifests. I talked about the environment, and more so from the rehab team context and clinician context, and what that messaging, what we should consider that messaging to look like. And then the final piece is activity, the actual things we need to do on a day-to-day basis. So before I get into the evidence, I want to go over some concepts which you may be very, very familiar with and may not. So this might be a refresher for some. So in the realm of fatigue, there are a few things that a lot of healthcare providers recommend. And I should have said this at the beginning, but this is not a prescription for anyone to do anything specific. This is not me providing healthcare treatment, but more offering education on the different things that exist that you should speak to your healthcare providers about. The first is energy conservation, also known as the 4 Ps. The first one is planning. So creating a to-do schedule, and I'm sure all of us are very familiar with this. But it's not just about the to-do schedule, it's how we plan it out. Maybe we alternate between a hard task and an easy task. Maybe we alternate between things that we like to do and things that we don't like to do. Pacing. This means that we're taking breaks in anticipation. So we're not waiting till we completely empty our tank. We're taking intermittent breaks to preserve our energy over time. And also known as load splitting. Some of you might have heard that term before, tasks over time. For me, I have 2 toddlers at home that keep me very busy. Load splitting is kind of the name of the game in my house. I'll give you an example of this. Maybe in the morning, I might carry the laundry from the basement upstairs, dump it on the bed. Maybe when my daughter goes down, I sort the laundry, and then at night I'll fold it. And so those are 3 different time points in the day where I think to myself, oh, I'll just use this minute to do this. And it's not all at once at the end of the day when we're completely zonked. Prioritizing. Of course, this means the most important activities occur when you have the best energy. So perhaps you're writing emails, you're figuring things out for your treatment needs, you know that computer screen time is challenging for you, you will send those emails maybe in the morning if the morning is your best time of energy, when you're rested. Maybe it's in the afternoon after your walk. So you decide where you place those priorities and using your best energy in those instances. Positioning is another one. Optimizing your energy with proper ergonomics. And sitting where able could be an example. Maybe some of you have kitchen perch stools and you're chopping and you're not standing, so you're conserving some energy in that way. Maybe you're in your comfy lounger while you're sending your emails, so you're not worried about a straight back and being in the perfect posture if other things are bugging you. And so it's finding ways that work for you to really optimize the energy you do have. The other thing that's often recommended in terms of fatigue is cognitive behavioral therapy. And some of you might have experienced this or have loved ones that have experienced this. And this is really about the links between our automatic thoughts. So again, going back to my slide on our perceptions, I can't do it, so I won't do it. And then what that manifests in terms of behavior. Behavior being, I haven't done this in so long because I just know that I can't do it. And so CBT is really to reduce and eliminate those symptoms by changing thought patterns. So the whole idea is thoughts create our feelings, right? I'm so exhausted, I know I can't do it. That really bugs me. And now I'm even more tired. Behavior, I'm not going to go out to that restaurant that I wanted to do. And then the behavior reinforces the thoughts. I haven't gone to a restaurant in ages. I can't do it now. Another approach is exercise. So we're going to talk a lot about this today. And exercise ranges, of course, from low intensity to moderate intensity to high intensity. And I came across this blog that talked about how intense each of these things are, and it gave some good examples here as a reference. For low intensity, you can talk and sing without panting. Moderate intensity, you can comfortably talk, but you can't sing. And high intensity, you can't say more with more than a few words without gasping. And so if you look at all the examples at the bottom, low intensity can include casual walks. Oh, I don't know if someone wanted to say something. No? Okay.
Sounded like background noise, but I apologize if somebody wanted to say something. Please go.
Okay. So low intensity, here's where I really want to draw your attention. You can see the typical exercise techniques, right? A casual walk, stretching, maybe a light bike ride, but then there's everyday movements. What does that mean? That means getting up from your couch, making a meal, going to your sink, tidying your plates or washing them and putting them away. It means going upstairs or going to your laundry room and picking up a load of laundry. It means going outside to take the garbage out. Moderate intensity, this is, of course, uphill walking, weight training, swimming, things that will get your heart rate higher to where you can't sing anymore. And then the high intensity, of course, kind of in the realm of athletics, circuit training, sprints, high impact interval training, running, things that will really soar your heart rate to a maximum to really get into that cardiovascular peak. So going back to the everyday movements, this is part of everyday life. So the best exercise, what I'm trying to say here is the best exercise is doing things that you would otherwise do. It doesn't always need to be in the form of homework. It could actually mean, today I'm going to do a load of laundry, and today I'm going to make a batch meal so that I don't have to cook every single day. And so these are everyday movements that count as low intensity. You did something great if you're living your life every day. And so this is where I want to get into and introduce the evidence base for fatigue intervention. And so I came across this really fantastic systematic review and meta-analysis All that to say, this is the highest form of evidence that research has, that exists, that comments on how effective things are. So the researchers will go out there, will pool all of the studies that have looked at various interventions, and will say, based on all of this, this is effective, it's not, we don't have enough information, you should consider this. So that is what is meant by a systematic review. And so here there was one conducted specifically for fatigue self-management, led by occupational therapists or physiotherapists. And this is by Kim and colleagues in 2022. So fairly new research, which is nice to see. And the purpose was to investigate how effective these self-management programs were for individuals with chronic conditions. So not just TBI, and it spanned across a variety of populations. These were self-management interventions specifically developed to improve fatigue symptoms, okay, no matter what condition you had. 38 studies, and those interventions included exercise, which I talked to you about, energy conservation, going back to the 4 Ps, pacing, prioritizing, planning, positioning, activity pacing, CBT, and comprehensive fatigue management. And I'll explain what that means. You will see a very daunting chart in front of you. I am not going to go over this, but it is there for your reference if you are interested in all the nuances of what each of these interventions had to offer. I simply wanted to present it if any clinicians were there and wanted to see how each of these interventions were defined in the literature, like how exercise is defined, or multimodal programs, or things like a comprehensive fatigue management program. So that's the bottom row here, where it's not just one specific approach, but maybe clients are taught about the importance of exercise, stress management, sleep hygiene, or keeping daily activity logs of what energizes them and what causes fatigue. But I want you to keep in mind the take homes here. So if you hate all that jargon and seeing it and it's too overwhelming, I don't blame you, but this is the take home and simplifying it all. That the majority of interventions that this study looked like, that this study examined rather, that were activity and exercise based, despite how often they told clients to exercise and how long they told clients to exercise, low to moderate intensity exercise helped reduce fatigue, improved quality of life, and lended to better sleep. And these were significant findings. So more so than the group that didn't have access to that type of therapy. So exercise and activity was very good in terms of offering outcomes in fatigue reduction and quality of life and sleep. Here's the interesting part. When interventions were only focused on passive interventions.
Can you hear that, Aoife? No? I don't know.
Is that a question?
Can you hear it now?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
Sorry, I
Okay.
don't know if there's a question.
I think it's Anne. Anne, do you have a question?
No.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Sorry, I was just getting back to saying that the interventions that focused on passive approaches, like taking breaks, pacing yourself, did not show significant differences in reducing fatigue. This isn't to say that they're not helpful, but in only doing this, there wasn't a change in how people reported their fatigue severity. And then the last piece is that cognitive behavioral therapy, going back to therapy that helps us change our thoughts and then subsequently our behaviors, results in significant improvements in fatigue and illness perception. Illness perception being the thought that we can't do it, even when we might be able to, but our emotions are holding us back because we're scared of the repercussions. And so here, the main point to drive home is regular forms of activity and behavior change should be considered in fatigue intervention. So it's not enough to say, just take breaks and rest, but it's also really great to say things like, what activities can you try and do? And if you are having a struggle with getting yourself to start them in the first place because you're scared or anxious or fearful, then behavior changes and triggering new thought processes will be important as well. So this brings me to the point that I kind of started off with in the beginning, that not all fatigue is created equal. And you'll see I have images here of different batteries, and those batteries can be rearranged a million different ways. Maybe that full battery goes to the social area for someone and not for someone else. And so what I mean to say here is we all have to identify what our energizers are and the things that deplete us to kind of talk about or experience fatigue. And so for physical, this could mean going for a walk, going for a swim. Cognitively, an activity could be learning a new recipe or engaging in puzzles or crosswords, or reading. Socially, maybe it's calling a friend, going out for dinner. And spiritually, it might need meditation or going to church or mosque or listening to prayers, kind of guided chapters. So all of these things, what I mean to say here is each of these things will energize us in very different ways, and they might deplete us in others. And the second point is that if one of these buckets is depleted, perhaps we worked really hard, we did a lot of house chores, as is the case over the weekends, that maybe you're done physically. I can't do any more physical activity. That's good enough for me. But instead of thinking about, now I'm going to rest, you might consider a different bucket to dip into. So when one bucket is down, a different bucket of activity is something to be considered before you consider inactivity. So you're so depleted in one area, maybe you're going to call a friend. Or you're so exhausted from being at that restaurant, I'm going to go for a run now or a brisk walk. So it takes energy to make energy. I really like this saying, and I don't have someone that quotes it, but this goes back to the whole perception of being able to work towards something, that your fatigue and energy levels, unfortunately, won't return on their own naturally. In some cases they do, and that's wonderful. But in other cases, living our life, doing everyday movement, considering all the buckets that we have access to becomes really important. In that using that energy actually builds up the reserve. You can consider it an energy muscle that we have to exercise in order to make more of it. And so after everything I've said today, perhaps you're wondering, where can I get the help for all of these things? And so that might be in the form of exercise, in which case you might be connecting with a physiotherapist, a kinesiologist for some healthcare programming or home exercise programs. Perhaps it's an OT. And OTs, of course, I can speak most confidently there. They cover the areas of energy conservation and coping, promoting symptom-limited activity. So doing things that we know we will experience some symptoms with, but won't completely deplete us. So we're doing things in a healthy range. Perhaps that means creating a new daily routine so that we're sufficiently busy and active. Maybe it's connecting with an RSW, so a rehabilitation support worker, to help us to get out of the house, help us use some of our energy that we have, and encouraging outings. Perhaps you're connecting with a social worker, a psychotherapist, or even an OT to understand your fatigue triggers and energizers, or engage in CBT. And then, of course, always talking to your general physician about all of the other factors that might lead to this unexplained fatigue, or this fatigue that maybe seems like it's not getting any better. Maybe that means you're being referred to a sleep study, or maybe it means that there are issues with your medications and side effects and the management of all of those things. So lots of people to connect with for different purposes, and all that work together to mitigate fatigue. So I want to round us back to the learning objectives. I hope that you have a more everyday life understanding of what fatigue looks like, and what it should feel like, and knowing that it's very normal and expected in the recovery process. That sometimes our views of our past selves or the way that our loved ones were sometimes acts as a barrier to how we understand the new life now. Knowing that the healthcare provider and the environment of our rehab also contributes to fatigue and how that is mitigated or intervened with. I hope I didn't bore you too much in going over a very brief evidence base of what exists right now in terms of what's effective at reducing fatigue symptoms and improving quality of life. And that you have lots of, now that you've come to this presentation, hopefully now you understand that there are lots of different buckets that you can dip into that can energize you when you think about, resting versus maybe doing something else that you have room for in your energy bucket. And so my take-home message, I know I've said this so many times, I'm clearly very passionate about it, but living life is the ultimate form of fatigue management. And so here, it's really important to maintain structure and have a daily routine for yourself. I'm going to get up at this time. I'm going to do this at this time. I'm going to make my lunch every day at 12:30. I'm going for an afternoon walk, so on and so forth. That you're setting realistic goals and you're reflecting on those goals continuously. Perhaps right now as you're building one extra thing into your week, on Fridays, I'm going to get back to going to a yoga class, or maybe it's a more intense workout, or maybe it's trying to read a book that you haven't read yet. Knowing your fatigue triggers and energizers. So I talked about that a lot today. Prioritizing your activities and knowing when and how to use your best energy. This one's really important. Practicing acceptance and self-compassion versus being rigid and having a very strict schedule. Some of us get really, really scared when we've defined this perfect schedule. We know we're not going to rock the fatigue boat too much if we try one activity over the other. But if it means your joy and happiness, that's okay. Perhaps you overload yourself one time because you're having the best time at an amusement park, at a music concert, at a festival. That's okay. The next day might feel rough, but know that it's temporary and you'll get back on track. So practice that acceptance if it means that you're living a better life for yourself. Load split and pace. This is what I said before about my crazy schedule of how I unload and fold my laundry, which seems to take nearly 12 hours in the day. And then, of course, avoid complete inactivity. So that's the goal here, is that we don't want to completely become sedentary because there are secondary impacts to that. If we are resting for the vast majority of the day, our systems, not just the fatigue generated by our brains, but the rest of our bodies get deconditioned. We don't have the physical tolerance anymore. We don't have the mental tolerance anymore. And so all of these just play into more avoidance and activity. I'm not going to go over this list. I left it in here in case clinicians were interested. These are different fatigue measures. I am certainly not familiar with all of them, but I grabbed them from the systematic review. And there are references here in the corner, 1 and 4, which state all of these and provide really great descriptions for those clinicians who are looking to capture fatigue in a more functional way versus just saying, how tired are you? These are all the references. And that is my talk. Thank you so much.